Thank you for the invitation. I'm so delighted to be here, and congratulations to all my fellow artists in the panel today. It's wonderful to see your work and to learn from it. I can see already lots of points of connection, and I can't wait to have a little discussion afterwards where we can all, compare notes. I prepared a little presentation about some of my work here, really in relationship to industrial heritage. So I'm going to share screen now, and let's see if this will work. Can you guys see the screen okay? And do you get the full screen here now?
Yes.
Yes. Super. Okay, great. So, artists have been in a very interesting relationship to industrial heritage for a very long time. I'm particularly interested in the artists that since the 19th century have been looking at the products of industry that are unintentional. And in particular, the pollution that comes off of these kind of monumental industrial heritage sites. Artists look very closely at the world, are very attentive at the changes in the world. And so actually artists have been at the forefront of environmental protection, of the regulation of emissions. And here we have Sir Richmond, who was an artist himself and actually became an activist and founded the Coal Smoke Abatement Society in 1898. And of course, you can see him with his palette. This is a newspaper, drawing a caricature in which he's trying to fight King Coal. King Coal doesn't seem to mind very much. There's a little marionette over to the bottom right-hand side that's kind of making fun of him. So obviously the sword's going to go through the smoke and nothing's going to happen. But things have happened, and I want to just, talk a little bit about how, in a way, art can be a way of making us think a little bit differently about, first of all, industrial heritage, and secondly, about pollution. Because, of course, we tend to think of industrial heritage as the great, mechanism of capitalist production to make products. But there is this, what Marx would call constitutive externality of making pollution. And we have now a very clear sense, but really began in the early 19th century, of what the effects of this pollution are on the heritage themselves, on the world themselves. And here's a very famous picture of acid rain, that, the effects of it in Germany at the Ruhr Valley. But of course, acid rain was discovered really in the early half of the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, by a preservationist, a Scottish preservationist by the name of Robert Angus Smith, who was also a chemist. And he looked at the industrial buildings of Manchester, and was able to find that the mortar joints were actually falling apart a little bit too quickly. So artists, preservationists are really, again, at the forefront of this understanding of the downside of the costs of industrial heritage, which I think some of my fellow artists here on the panel have already started to point to. But when we think about the heritage of industry, we typically tend to focus on the factory building. But of course, the factory building is an architectural object. But then the question is, where does architecture really end if the very existence of that architectural object is contingent on it producing this cloud of smoke that is going to extend for miles around it? So can we consider that cloud of smoke as part of the heritage itself? I would say yes, because we can't have that heritage without that smoke. And that heritage and that smoke production is not just heritage sites, but here you have Chicago in 1908. These are heating boilers for inside the buildings to warm up buildings. These are little, industrial smokestacks inside of every single building. So in fact, modern architecture could not really be disconnected with industry. It is part, and now we think about it that way, of a kind of process of extraction, consumption and disposal of materials that involves the entire planet. So I love Abel and Orhan's project in that sense, as well as some of Saba and Timothy's, and we'll get to those in a second. But just this image is, to me, has been one that has fascinated me. This is Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was the center of steel production in the United States. A lot of smoke coming out of industry. You could not see the sun for about 130, 150 years in Pittsburgh when the factories were on, because there was so much dust in the air that it covered it up. And so that led to, after World War II, when America deindustrialized, this great moment of let's clean up the city. Let's wash all of the facades. And so you had the development of preservation as a kind of facade cleaning project. This was the big industrial boom of preservation, was facade cleaning. By the way, this happened all over the world. France and Paris, André Malraux cleaned all of Paris, the same idea, right? And the idea was, let's return back to a pre-industrial time, to a kind of clean time. But all these buildings were designed to be sooted. They were all designed to be dirtied. And in fact, the choice of materials, these are all glazed terracotta buildings. The glazed terracotta was a substitute for stone, because stone decayed under acid rain, but glazed terracotta, because it had that glaze on it, did not. And so these were all meant to be buildings that were to be under acid rain constantly. But of course, when they cleaned them, they started changing the look of it to a kind of invention that these were going to be clean buildings. And so my question really began, the series of projects began as a preservationist, called upon to clean building, asking the question, what are we cleaning here? Why are we taking this dust off? There is a history to be told over here in the dust, but how can we save it? So I started developing, a technique to essentially apply a latex paste to the surface of the buildings. And the latex paste, as is water-based, and as it is applied to the surface of the building, it dries. And as it dries, the water creates a kind of pooling effect on the surface of the building and removes all of the dust from the surface of the facades, or of the various surfaces in which they are applied. And so then as the latex dries, then I literally just peel it off of the surface of the building, and what you get is a cast of the surface of the building with the dust stuck in it. And so here you have an example of how that is coming off. Now, here's a project that I did for the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, in which I cast the interior of Trajans Column, which is their largest object in the collection, and showed the dust of it next to the cast. This is a very interesting story, because the cast is made out of plaster. It was commissioned by Napoleon III when the French were in charge of Italy. They had colonized Italy essentially, and they realized already in 1863 that the very delicate bas-relief of this surface was eroding under the effects of acid rain. And so they decided to cast it as a way to preserve this monument. They installed it back on the Victoria and Albert Museum around a chimney, which to me was amazing, right? Because the chimney is the example of the industrial era, is the symbol of the industrial era. But they put these pieces of monument that were supposed to be a saving from industrial heritage around essentially a chimney that was built by the same guys that were building the industrial chimneys at Leeds and in other places in the UK. Now, for me, it was very important to put this cast inside this room, because this room was the poor man's grand tour of Europe. This room contained casts of all the major monuments of Europe. So if you couldn't travel like a rich man, then you went to the Victoria and Albert Museum and actually just looked at these things. So I wanted to put pollution inside this room, because this room symbolized the kind of epitome of culture. And for me, it was important to say, look, we can't have this culture without making this pollution. These two things go hand in hand. Now, how do we deal with this pollution? How do we understand the pollution as being culturally significant, as being part of culture? It's very hard, because if you read, Mary Douglas, for example, who wrote that book, on pollution and taboo, she says, pollution is matter out of place. Pollution has no place in culture. Pollution is precisely the external part of culture. We don't count it because it's threatening, it's dangerous. So for me, it was very interesting to start thinking about pollution as part of culture. And so this was, of course, if you've taken History 101, you take this, you see this painting, Georges Seurat, the beginning of Impressionism, a new way of looking at the world. This is the relaxation of the Sunday. We know it's Sunday because the chimneys in the back, if you can see the chimneys, they're not producing smoke, except for one that's producing smoke. So the chimneys are very important in this painting to cue us into the reality of the life world that these figures are experiencing, but also to this idea of a new way of seeing the world through pointillism. And I was commissioned by Louis Vuitton to do a piece for their new museum, which is actually in their old industrial factory in Asnières. And actually, by the way, these chimneys back here, this is Asnières, that's Louis Vuitton's factory, one of those chimneys. We don't know exactly which one. So this is the exact location of one of those chimneys that Georges Seurat painted. On the left is Mr. Louis Vuitton's house. On the right is the industrial heritage site, the factory where all the bags were made. And so in the middle, you can see the street where all the goods came in and out. You can see my scaffolding on the left to try to clean that. The facade was already pretty clean, but actually we found that there had been a lean-to addition. If you can see my cursor, the little brick is a different color over there. They had built a little garbage room there to save all of the, to hide all the garbage, because they were now using this for, high-end dinners and so on for their high clients. So I cast the garbage room, and this is the casting of the garbage room. Why the garbage room? Because this is the only place where I could find actually original pollution from the 19th century. So this became the entrance to their private museum with all the major collection pieces, all the steamer trunks that were used to travel across the Atlantic to colonize Africa. This was, a major part of how Louis Vuitton became the company that it did. But this was a very courageous idea, on the part of the curators to say, we're going to put the pollution that this factory created as the first thing you see when you walk into the museum. That to me was very important. And so helping people see the world, see pollution, and see the world in a different way, I think is something that as artists, we're always called to do. And here you have a big influence for me, John Ruskin, who was, one of the critics that in a way brought in the idea of modern painting in the 19th century, big defender of Turner, anti-academy, a kind of romanticist, look back at nature, but he was very good at looking at buildings. And look at the picture he took of the Doge's Palace on the left. It's full of pollution. And look at the one on the right, it's completely clean. The building is constantly being cleaned now because our expectation is that when a building is being taken care of, it is actually always clean. So for the Venice Biennale, I was asked to do a project, and I found the last remaining polluted wall that was in the Doge's Palace, which is this wall over here. You can see this arch has already been cleaned, but behind the arch, which is right behind over here, that had not been cleaned because no tourist can see that wall. So they just, never paid for it. Nobody wanted to pay for it. So we actually cleaned that wall. And that is what you get. That is the wall itself of the dust that is removed from that surface. Now, there's a long story to be told about each of these projects, but I learned something new about them in every case. We don't have time to get too much into each of them. We can talk about them later if you want. But this is a project that in a way started the whole thing as well, which was a project for Manifesta, the European Contemporary Art Biennial that was done at Bolzano on an old factory, aluminum factory. Aluminum is one of the most energy intensive metals to produce, so it pollutes a lot. So it is why we started recycling aluminum first. Now, this whole building was built by Mussolini's government as a way to Italianize the north of Italy, which, as you all know, was part of Austria before, and everybody there speaks German, which Mussolini didn't like. So he wanted to send a bunch of Italians up there to work in the factories. So industrial heritage was a way also to create mass migration of populations. All the Italians went up there to work, but the German-speaking folk that were there, they didn't like that very much. So they ended up creating two different towns. And still to this day, there is an Italian-speaking town and a German-speaking town in Bolzano. So this factory symbolized, in a way, a point of contested heritage. It was a place of both tension in the city, and they just, they demolished it and now made it into a cultural center. So what I did was to say, let me save the last bit of dust on this facade, on this interior, machine hall. You can see on the left has already been cleaned. The back of the machine hall is still dirty. So I pulled it off with this, latex cast. Here's the clock of the facade of the machine hall, the timing of the heritage. And here you see the surface of that skin being removed. You can kind of get behind it on the scaffolding and see that. And so this interest in the dust took me to this mine in Spain, this Roman mine in Spain, where the Romans conquered Spain because they needed silver to fuel the empire. The empire was growing, and the more people in the empire, the more silver they needed to introduce coins to keep them in the economy. So they conquered the mines of Spain, which is still like a moon landscape. They completely, turned the landscape inside out and polluted the entire place. So I went there and did these casts of these ancient Roman, so industrial heritage of the Roman Empire, for me was very important, because we tend to think of industrial heritage as something modern and contemporary, but actually the Romans were already, very good at industry. This was exhibited in Australia, actually, because they're very interested in pollution as well. They export most of the coal that's burnt in China. But what was interesting for me was that in 1992, one of the European research institutes found dust from this mine in Spain in the North Pole. And because of the very stable lead isotope that is a byproduct of producing silver. So what blew my mind was that the Romans already polluted the world's atmosphere. They made so much money, let's say, in the production of money, that was their major industry. They already polluted the world's atmosphere. So it completely cast a different idea for me in terms of what the Anthropocene is, because everybody's looking for a marker of the Anthropocene. What constitutes the beginning of the Anthropocene? I would say the Romans would be a good place to start. That would be the beginning of the Anthropocene. When the Roman Empire falls, airborne pollution drops from the 4th century, essentially for 1,000 years, till the Spaniards discover the silver mines in Peru, and then atmospheric pollution shoots up again. So I became very interested in money and the way that money pollutes. And I, for the San Francisco MoMA, did this project in which I cleaned the old United States Mint, where all the gold from the gold rush was turned into money. It's now a historic site. It has been commemorated in these coins. It's called the Granite Lady. And those 2 chimneys had never been cleaned. So I went ahead and cast those 2 chimneys and, picked up all the dust and the pollution that was the byproduct of making all the dollars that were made on that site. Now, of course, there's a consciousness raising part of this project, but there is also an interest in, how do you affect policy? Once you start, helping people see the way in which our built environment is essentially an environmental sensor, that it is collecting a kind of register of our industrial existence and the environmental pollution that is in the air as a result of that industrial production and existence. How do you then begin to actually help to change things? Well, I thought that, one of the ways to do it would be to try to bring this project to the policymakers, to the politicians. And so the Westminster Hall, as you know, is the 2 chambers of government for the UK government. It is on the right-hand side. This little door is the entrance to Westminster Hall. That building is 1,000 years old. It's the oldest building of government being continuously used for governmental purposes. All of Big Ben and all of that was built in 1832 after a big fire. But in that big fire, Westminster Hall was saved. Now, the Houses of Parliament have been the subject of a lot of interest from the point of view of artists who were actually documenting not just the Houses of Parliament, but actually the air in between them and the Houses of Parliament. These famous paintings by Claude Monet are paintings of the atmosphere. They're atmospheric paintings that they're trying to, document they're calling it fog, but we would call it today smog. It's actually pollution in the air. So I went ahead and cast the walls of Westminster Hall, and then put these casts, which were, you can see here, this is the clean wall now, this is the pollution that was inside that wall. There's a very important space because this is the room where the first king was decapitated because of an exercise of absolute power. So this is Charles I, and as you know, Charles I wanted to be an absolute monarch, just like Louis XIV, because he said that's the way to run a modern state. You need absolute monarchy, otherwise, you can't make fast enough decisions. And the parliament took him aside and said, you can't do that, and then decided to decapitate him. So after that, what we get is this modern notion of a parliamentary democracy and the idea of electing a king every 4 years or so on to go. For me, it was very important to bring this other longer history into this space where this has been mostly the space of politicians, of telling the history of really important, people at the top. I wanted to tell the history of the environment here. So what ended up happening here was that, of course, we had, by chance, when we opened the show, it turned out to be the day of Brexit. And so this piece became associated with the whole idea of a new kind of world order where the British are leaving the European Union and so on. And so it was very interesting to see how people exchanged, moved, behaved around this object in relationship to Löw and Aria. How people behave around objects to me was very important. This is, I was able to see, Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson in this hall the day after the vote, completely frazzled and almost dazed like zombies, not knowing where to go. And they actually were hiding behind these curtains, taking phone calls and trying to make sense of what to do while all the journalists were on the main hall. So, there is a kind of way in which these casts begin to help us think about our relationship to the environment as being already registered in the world around us. But by bringing it forth, we can see architecture and the world around us as more than just, let's say, aesthetic objects, but as telling another story. And for me, that story was very important. And all these pieces, in a way, when they come together, they're really not so much about buildings, but about the atmosphere, because it is the atmosphere that deposits all of this dust onto these buildings. So they tell a larger world story, the story of environmental pollution around the globe when you put them all together. And so I was very interested, for example, in the idea of moving objects and the imagination that Saba and Timothy put on the table, because in a way, mobile art is created as a way to move objects around. And these pieces are a way to move the surface of architecture into a canvas that then becomes, let's say, a form of painting, which is back to the Renaissance when people started putting painting not on walls, but on canvas. That was the same, movable object idea to spark a different kind of imagination. I think that's very important in terms of Saba and Timothy's project, that as you move these projects around, they still maintain a connection to their place of origin. There is something really interesting that kind of ties into all of these projects that, Benjamin, you're bringing up, this question of movement, and perhaps we're more attuned to it because we couldn't move. But if you think of, for example, the Parthenon, right? The Parthenon is really in London, at the Vatican Museums, it's in Copenhagen. If you go to Athens, most of it is actually down the hill. It's not on the Acropolis. So buildings move, and the more important they are, the more they move. So I think what's interesting in all these projects is that you're all making us think of heritage as not something that is stable, but something that starts to become translated into other media, that starts to circulate, that can inhabit the outer space, that can be transmitted through a network of satellites, that can be transmitted through a network of objects that have stories. And so I think that that's a really interesting way in which artists are actually pushing the notion of heritage beyond the obsession with the physical, stable object. And artists are raising, and all of you are raising, these very important questions about how do we tell the stories of other people? What responsibility do we have to tell those stories? I think Saba and Timothy's project was really interesting. Also, the way in which they tied into this whole already the history of telling other people's stories with these beautiful, tapestries or canvases, right, that were unrolled by these storytellers. So to me, that is a really interesting way of trying to push the idea of mobility, of heritage, that heritage itself is a way to help us move stories from one place to another. And in that sense, I think Abel and Orhan were really prescient when they said, that heritage is something that we cannot interact with in the way we want. That you show up at a heritage site like this factory, for example, this cement factory that you're all supposed to work in, and you can't interact with it the way you want. But if you show up at the Parthenon, you also can't interact with it the way you want, because all the heritage infrastructure has been set in place to prevent you from having the experience that you want. So I think that all of you have found other ways to create new forms of interactions with heritage that connect to Benjamin's questions about aesthetic decisions and what are the methods for making those aesthetic decisions. In fact, I think you're all pointing to the way in which we can change the way we understand heritage by moving to a different plane, where we're working not just on representations, but actually on the networks, on the connections that connect all heritage sites together, whether they be satellites, whether they be the museum networks. And then the question for me would be, what is our critical position vis-a-vis those networks? We've seen in the past few years a whole rising consciousness about the need to return the objects of museums to their original places in the effort to decolonize the museum. So how would we take some of that idea to satellite sites and to the idea that they are, in a sense, inhabiting all our common space? Because that to me pushes beyond the notion of the nationalistic border framing of heritage, which is at the heart of the notion of the return of objects to their original country, which is nationalistic. It's one nation returning an object to another nation. But here you guys are talking about the new frontiers of the commons, the oceans, outer space, and how do we then begin to move up? How do artists begin to move objects in those space? To me, that's really, really interesting in terms of it raises all sorts of new questions about the methods and the scope of artistic practice, because you are beyond the limits of what a museum can do, beyond the limits of what collecting can do, and you're opening up a whole new way of telling a story, but also new sorts of critical responsibility comes with that. How do you tell other people's story when you're dealing with satellites? Everybody's stories are going through those satellites right now, right? Our Zoom is probably going through the satellites right now. So, how do we even begin to pull those stories out when we don't have really access to the, to the infrastructure? So anyway, Ben, it's just a way of trying to respond to your very provocative question about, which I think is very important. How do we make decisions about the way heritage looks? I think we have to rethink what heritage is ontologically. And I think all the artists here are really at the border of these frontiers about what is heritage, and questioning very much the idea that it is something that doesn't move. They're all making heritage dance across cultures and territories in amazing ways.